The sun beat down on the city of Medina, but the silence in the alleys spoke louder than the wind. The streets, once echoing with the footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, now trembled under the rule of fear. Just a few years had passed since Karbala, and yet it felt as if the heart of Islam had already cracked in more places than one. Yazid sat on the throne in Damascus, a seat of power claimed with blood, not prayer. His name was feared, not loved. After the murder of Imam Hussain, voices across the Muslim world were shaking with regret. But fear had closed their mouths. Except one. Abdullah ibn Zubair stood in Makkah, refusing to give allegiance to Yazid. He was brave, devout, and unafraid to speak when others trembled. Makkah, the sanctuary, the land of safety, had become the last place where truth could breathe. And so people began turning toward him, not because he promised power, but because he refused to bend, and Yazid noticed. He watched as scholars, elders, even former companions began to migrate to Makkah. He heard whispers that people no longer mentioned his name in Friday sermons, that they had begun rallying behind a man who reminded them of courage, of principle, of the days when Islam was alive with sincerity. This Yazid could not allow. He summoned Muslim ibn Uqba, an old and ruthless general known for crushing opposition without mercy. Yazid's orders were clear. March to Medina, silence the rebellion, and if need be invade Mecca. Medina was the first to suffer. Muslim ibn Uqba stormed the holy city in what became known as the Hira massacre. Blood ran in the streets. The descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the children of the companions and innocent worshippers were slain. The sacredness of the Prophet's city was trampled under the boots of Yazid's army, but Abdullah ibn Zubair escaped. He took his family and supporters and entered Makkah. There he did not declare war. He declared refuge, and the Kaaba opened its arms. He stood at the doors of the sacred house and said, "We take shelter in Allah and in his house from the tyrant who has forgotten who he rules." People gathered around him, not with swords, but with tears. Old men remembered the Prophet, peace be upon him. Women wept for the loss of Hussain. The Kaaba, silent and timeless, stood between two worlds, one that still remembered truth, and one that worshipped fear. Yazid was enraged. He sent another general, Hussain ibn Numair, with one command: lay siege to Makkah, crush the rebellion, break their hope. And so an army of thousands marched toward the holiest city on earth, bearing not the Quran, but catapults, not the Sunnah, but fire. When Hussain ibn Numair arrived, he surrounded the city. No water in, no food out. The people of Makkah were locked inside their own sanctuary, punished for sheltering the truth. But what happened next would shake the sky. The army began launching stones, fireballs, and missiles into the city. And then one night, under a black sky lit by flame, a fireball struck the Kaaba itself. The cloth burned. The structure cracked. The house of Allah, the place where Ibrahim had raised its walls, where the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had wept in prayer, was on fire. Smoke rose into the sky as the people screamed. Mothers clutched their children. Men ran to fetch water, but found only sand. The Kaaba, the Qibla of the world, was burning before their eyes, and no one stopped it. The soldiers of Yazid stood firm. Some looked away, others whispered to themselves. But no one said, "This is wrong." Not even those who had memorized the Quran, not even those who knew the history of this sacred place, because power had blinded them, and fear had paralyzed. Then, inside Mecca, Abdullah ibn Zubair stood near the burning walls, holding his cloak around his shoulders. His face was blackened with ash, but his eyes were steady. He shouted toward the enemy lines, "Do you not fear Allah? Do you not remember that this is His house, not mine? If you hate me, then take my life." But how can you justify this, attacking the Kaaba? There was no reply because they had no justification, only orders, and so the betrayal continued. Some tried to extinguish the fire. They climbed the walls. They threw blankets. Others simply fell into sujud, begging Allah to forgive the Ummah for what it had become. The Kaaba burned for days. The stones crumbled. The black cloth, once kissed by pilgrims with love, now lay in ashes. The sacredness of the place had not been broken by enemies of Islam, but by those who claimed to be its protectors. And somewhere in the distance, the legacy of Karbala whispered through the smoke, because the same hands that had turned away from Imam Hussain had now turned their swords toward the Kaaba. And the Ummah, again, was silent. Among the people inside Makkah was an old woman. Her name was Sumayya. She had seen the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as a child. She remembered the days when Bilal called Adhan barefoot from the Kaaba's steps. She remembered the smile of Lady Fatima, walking beside her father. She remembered the words of Imam Ali, calling for justice. And now she sat under a burning sky, weeping not just for the Kaaba, but for the hearts of the believers. She said, "When we betrayed Hussain, we opened the door to this. When we stayed quiet, we gave permission. When we allowed the blood of the Prophet's grandson to be spilled without rising, we gave them courage to attack even Allah's house." That night she died in sujud, facing the Qibla, asking Allah to awaken the sleeping hearts of the Ummah. Allah listened, because the next morning news arrived that shook the enemy ranks. Yazid was dead. The tyrant who had ordered the attack was gone. His empire was cracking. His army froze. Hussain ibn Numair panicked. Without orders, he could not justify continuing the attack. He sent a messenger to Abdullah ibn Zubair, offering peace, but the damage had been done. The Kaaba was burned. The world had watched. And history had recorded. This was not just a political failure. This was a spiritual collapse. A moment where power mattered more than sacredness, where fear defeated faith, and where the Ummah proved once again it had not learned. From Karbala, the house of Allah can be rebuilt. But what about the house of Iman in our hearts? That remained broken. The smoke still hung in the air when the sun rose over Makkah. It wasn't the kind of sunrise that brings warmth or beauty. It was gray, dim, almost ashamed to shine over a land where betrayal had once again outshouted truth. The Kaaba, Allah's sacred house, the center of every prayer raised on earth, stood damaged, its black cloth in tatters, its stone walls darkened and cracked by fire. The people of Makkah moved silently that morning. No one spoke of politics. No one argued over who was right or wrong. There was only one truth visible to every eye that could see: the army that claimed Islam had set fire to the home of Islam itself. Men walked with their eyes lowered. Women clutched their children closer. And scholars sat in corners of broken masjids, trembling as they remembered verses that now echoed with bitter irony. And whoever honors the symbols of Allah, it is from the piety of the heart. But there was no honor now, only ashes inside the harem. Abdullah ibn Zubair stood where the Kaaba had once glowed in majesty. He wore simple white clothes, his face still streaked with soot and grief. Around him were a few companions, survivors, those who had stayed not to fight, but to protect the little that was left. He did not cry, not because he had no tears, but because his sorrow had gone deeper than crying. His sorrow had turned into silence. One of his followers said, "O Ibn Zubair, the house has burned," and the Ummah did not move. He replied quietly, "It wasn't the house that burned first. It was the hearts." Far away in Damascus, the palace of Yazid was colder than usual. The tyrant, once surrounded by poets and flatterers, now sat alone. A letter had arrived on his table, sealed with the symbol of the harem. It carried the report of his general. "The Kaaba has been hit, the siege is failing, and the people are breaking." He read it once, then again, and for the first time he did not smile, because even tyrants know some actions go too far. Even tyrants tremble when their crimes touch something sacred, and Yazid, the son of a man who once stood under the shadow of power, now faced a shadow he could not silence, a shadow that began in Karbala, a shadow that followed him from the blood of Imam Hussain, a shadow that now stood before the burning Kaaba that night. Yazid fell ill. Some say it was poison, others say it was fear, some say it was Allah's justice. But whatever it was, it came quickly. Within days, Yazid ibn Muawiyah was dead, and the world did not mourn him back in Makkah. The news of Yazid's death arrived like a whisper through the city. It passed from lips to ears, from doors to alleys, from hearts to hopes, but no one celebrated, because the damage he caused could not be undone by his death. The Kaaba was still scarred, the city was still in ruins, and the hearts of the believers were still struggling to understand how it had come to this. How did it happen? How did we go from following the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to burning his Qibla? How did we go from loving Ahl-e-Bait to watching their killers in power? No one had an answer, but the question lingered that evening. Abdullah ibn Zubair walked through the harem again. The fire had gone out, but the stone still steamed with heat. He looked up at what remained of the Kaaba and said softly, "You, Allah, if this is the cost of standing against tyranny, then let every stone burn, but not a single principle fall." He then turned to the people around him and said, "We will rebuild it. Not because we can undo what they did, but because we will not let their betrayal be the last chapter." The people nodded. Not all were strong, not all were fearless, but all had seen enough to know silence was no longer an option. Meanwhile, the soldiers who had come with Hussain ibn Numair stood restless. Their leader had lost his backing. The one who ordered the attack was gone, and without orders, they had no reason to stay. One of the younger soldiers, who had watched the Kaaba burn with tears in his eyes, approached his commander and said, "Was this jihad? Or was this madness?" The commander looked away, and for the first time he had no answer, because even in the hearts of those on the wrong side, truth knocks eventually, and when it does, it either awakens or destroys. The army retreated, not because of defeat, but because their mission had lost its face. But the retreat did not clean the blood, nor mend the broken stones, nor return the honor lost in fire that night. An old man named Abdullah ibn Umar, son of the great Caliph, visited the harem. He had not taken part in the rebellion. He had stayed silent through Karbala. He had stayed silent through the siege, but when he saw the Kaaba burned, he placed his hand on the charred wall and cried, "Oh, forgive us for not protecting your house. Forgive us for watching while truth was burned. Forgive us for fearing men more than you." His cries echoed through the night, and the people gathered not to debate, not to judge, but to weep the next day. Work began stone by stone, hand by hand. The people of Makkah started to rebuild the Kaaba, but rebuilding a house is easy. Rebuilding trust is not. Rebuilding the honor of the Ummah after Karbala, after Hira, after Makkah was a task no stone could accomplish, and yet some tried. A group of young boys whose fathers had died defending the harem carried bricks and water. One of them, no older than 10, looked up and said, "I wasn't there when they killed Hussain. I wasn't there when they burned the Kaaba, but I will be here when we fix what they destroyed." That sentence became a spark, a small light in a dark age, a reminder that from destruction hope can rise, but not everyone rebuilt. Some simply left too ashamed, too broken, too afraid, and others, those who had supported Yazid, began rewriting the story. They said, "Oh, it was a mistake. Oh, the fire was accidental. Oh, the rebels caused it." They rewrote history to clean their hands. They erased names, they silenced survivors, they bribed scribes, and so the betrayal didn't end with fire. It continued through fabricated books, distorted memories, changed sermons, but the stones knew. The walls remembered, and those who lived through it passed the truth in whispers to their children years later. A scholar visiting Makkah asked an elderly man about the cracks in one side of the Kaaba's foundation. Man said, "These are not cracks, my son. These are the scars of betrayal, scars that remind us what happens when we forget who we are." The scholar asked, "Can they ever be repaired?" The old man smiled faintly. "Only when the Ummah loves truth more than it fears kings." In that same city, a girl named Ruqayya once stood beneath the shadow of the Kaaba. She had been born after Karbala, but she carried its grief in her eyes. She had never seen Imam Hussain, but she whispered his name in every dua she had never held. The black cloth of the Kaaba before it burned, but she touched the new cloth and said, "Ya Allah, let this cloth cover not just stone, but shame. Let it cover our silence, our cowardice, our betrayal." And then she cried not for what was lost, but for what still might be found, because even after fire, even after destruction, even after betrayal, as long as someone stands to say enough, as long as someone refuses to stay silent, as long as someone remembers Karbala, there is still hope. The Kaaba can be attacked, but it cannot be erased, because what it represents is not stone, but submission, and submission, when pure, can never be conquered. The Kaaba stood once again, newly rebuilt, wrapped in fresh black cloth. Its walls were no longer scorched. The cracks had been patched. The sacred structure appeared whole. But those who had witnessed the fire knew some wounds cannot be seen, and some betrayals can't be erased by stone. The people of Makkah had gone back to their lives. The markets reopened. The pilgrims slowly returned. The adhan once again echoed from the minarets. On the surface it seemed Islam had survived, but deep within the hearts of many something remained broken, because Even if the house was restored, the hearts of the Ummah were still scattered. The betrayal that began in Karbala had reached its highest point when fire was launched upon the very Qibla of Islam. And yet what followed was even more tragic. Silence, denial, and then forgetfulness. The children who saw the Kaaba burn grew up hearing two versions of history. In one version, the siege of Makkah was a mistake, a battle between rebels, an accident of war, something unfortunate, yes, but nothing to grieve over. In another version, told only in whispers, the truth remained. The Ummah had stood silent as tyrants attacked the house of Allah and called it politics. Which version survived? The convenient one, because truth is often buried when it hurts too. Much to face, years later, a man from Kufa visited Makkah. He walked slowly around the rebuilt Kaaba, his fingers grazing the smooth new cloth. He was old now, his beard white, his back bent, but his eyes carried a fire that had not dimmed with age, a fire that had begun the day he watched Muslim Ibn Akhil dragged through the streets of Kufa and did nothing, a fire that burned deeper when news of Imam Hussein's slaughter reached him, and he had chosen to look away. He stood in front of the Kaaba and whispered, "I was there. I saw what they did, and I said nothing." His tears fell freely, not because he had sinned once, but because he had stayed silent for years. Because silence, when stretched over time, becomes complicity. He raised his hands and said, "Yeah, Allah, you forgave those who killed prophets. Will you forgive me for watching yours be betrayed?" But forgiveness requires more than tears. It requires memory. And most of the Imam forgot. The scholars of power wrote new books. They removed the mention of the fire. They glorified the tyrants who ordered it. They silenced the voices of those who stood with the truth. Even in Friday sermons, names like Yazid were no longer condemned. Some even praised him. The killing of Imam Hussain became a political disagreement. The burning of the Kaaba, a strategic event. History was rewritten, one scroll at a time. But Allah's records do not forget Dot in one village far from the cities. An old woman named Fatima gathered children around her. She had no titles, no wealth, no books, but she carried memories past, down from her grandmother who had been in Makkah when the fire consumed the house. Fatima told the children, "My loves, don't believe the stories that make evil look wise. Don't believe the people who say the Kaaba wasn't harmed. I saw the smoke. I smelled the stone burning. I heard the cries. I held the hand of a child who asked, 'Why is Allah's house on fire?' And I had no answer. The children listened. Wide-eyed. One asked, 'Why didn't anyone stop them?' And Fatima smiled sadly, because they were afraid. Another child whispered, 'Would we stop them now?' She paused, looked into their eyes, then said, 'Only if your love for truth becomes greater than your fear of pain.' Time passed. Generations changed. New rulers came. New scholars rose. The Kaaba remained, still honored, still visited, still prayed toward by millions. But the lesson of its burning faded, and in its place came something worse, ritual without meaning. People began to protect the structure of Islam, but forgot the soul of Islam. They kissed the black stone, but ignored the tears of the oppressed. They wrapped the Quran in silk, but neglected its command for justice. They built tall minarets, but left the hearts of believers empty. and whenever someone reminded them of what happened, Karbala, Hara, the burning of the Kaaba, they were told, "That's old history. Don't divide the Ummah. Forget and move on." But forgetting is what caused the fire in the first place. Some refused to forget. The lovers of Ahl-e-Bait, even in secret, kept the truth alive. In their majlis they cried for Hussain. In their du'as they remembered the betrayal. In their silence they mourned not just the martyrdom, but the failure of a nation to protect its prophet's blood and his Qibla. They taught their children not just to love the Kaaba, but to defend the values it represents. They taught them that it is not enough to face the sea, Qibla in prayer. You must also face injustice with courage, that it is not enough to call yourself Muslim. You must choose between Yazid and Hussain in every generation. That Karbala never ended, and the fire over the Kaaba still burns inside us if we don't learn dot in today's world. The Kaaba stands tall, protected, guarded, honored. But how many people know that it once burned because of Muslims? How many people know that it wasn't? Non-believers who set it on fire. It was those who claimed to love Islam but feared tyrants more than they feared Allah. How many know that the betrayal of Hussain led directly to the betrayal of the Kaaba? And how many realize we are still repeating those betrayals today? Today, we don't launch fireballs at the Kaaba, but we support the powerful over the truthful. We justify the actions of corrupt leaders because they provide ease. We remain silent when the innocent are crushed, when the truth is buried, when justice is denied. We choose unity over truth, even when that unity is built on blood. We don't need catapults to betray the Kaaba. All we need is to protect the walls of Islam while abandoning its core. The lesson we were meant to learn was this: the Kaaba is a house of stone, but it becomes sacred through obedience, justice, and sacrifice when obedience is replaced with politics, when justice is sacrificed for silence, when sacrifice is replaced by greed. Then even the Kaaba burns. The burning of the Kaaba was not just an event in history. It was the reflection of an Ummah that had already burned its values. It was the scream of a religion betrayed by its own people. It was the smoke that rose not from firewood, but from fear, power, and denial. We say we love the Kaaba. We say we love the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. We say we love Hussain, but love is not in words. Love is in standing when standing hurts. Love is in defending when defending costs everything. Love is in remembering, even when forgetting is easier. The day the Kaaba was attacked is not just a story of the past. It is a warning that no place is sacred if the people inside it are not, that no structure is safe if the soul behind it is lost. So let us not be like the people who betrayed Imam Hussain. Let us not be like those who watched the Kaaba burn and looked away. Let us be like those who cry not just for what happened, but rise to make sure it never happens again, because the Kaaba still stands. But the question is, do we?